All right. Good morning, everybody. I know folks are piling in. We're going to get started in just a moment. Hold for some more folks to join. But good morning and welcome. Glad to have you here. I see some more folks have joined us. Thank you so much for being here. We are just holding another minute or so, just letting some more folks join. I will be getting started in just a minute. Thanks again for being here. All right. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for being here as we review and discuss the legislative priorities that have been laid out by our governor. My name is Chris Alexander. I'm the executive director of the NAACP New York State Conference. There we go. It is good to be here with you all. Thank you again for joining us. We will be joined and hear remarks from our president, L. Joy Williams. We were able to attend the State of the State yesterday and spend some time in Albany with our elected leaders, make sure that the agenda of the NAACP New York State Conference is being presented and highlighted and considered and discussed as other priorities are being laid out. It was an exciting day. I think people were pleased with some of the proposals that the governor presented and laid out. I think there was definitely some questions about what the final bill language will look like. But we are here to do an initial download, to talk about what we saw and heard, to talk about the issues that we've been hearing from our branches, our issues of priority, and to see how they're going to fit into the discussions occurring in Albany this legislative session, which has just kicked off. This is, our first briefing of this sort, but we also will be hosting our monthly briefings where we're providing updates on the legislative activity updates on where our bills are, the bills that we as a state conference have endorsed and supported, as well as the feedback that we're hearing from legislators and folks on the ground as well about how those priorities will impact their lives. And so this will be a continued engagement, but we're so excited to be here with you all today, and we will get started. All right. So first, of course, in terms of initial reactions, before our president jumps in, but for initial reactions, I think there was definitely some positivity around the governor's speech. There were particularly some significant calls and applause around the statements that she has made around immigration and doing more to protect New Yorkers from immigration enforcement. There's a bill that was endorsed by the New York State Conference, introduced by Senator Zelnor Myrie, that would create a private right of action for New Yorkers who've had their constitutional rights deprived by these ICE officials or federal officials engaging in conduct under the color of law. The governor advanced or gave us the framework of a proposal that would allow for some type of private right of action against these federal officials. And so we're excited to see what that looks like, to see how far and how easy or difficult it is to utilize that remedy and to bring claims in state court against federal officers who are, as we've seen both here in New York in immigration actions, but also elsewhere, quite regularly violating the rights of those who they're interacting with, both in the form of physical violence, as well as just general harassment, assault, and threatening folks, et cetera. And so that definitely was the proposal that I think got one of the most significant reactions, both from the audience physically there, but also from our branches and from our members who are very concerned about federal enforcement. And so as we go through some of these issues, definitely want to ask folks to throw questions in the chat as they come up. We are going to be sending out our full legislative agenda that will include bills like the one I just mentioned that align with proposals that are being laid out or going to be presented in the governor's budget when it is introduced. All right, so feel free to throw those questions in the chat. Okay, so the immigration discussion wasn't just on that private right of action. It was also about protecting sensitive spaces. There's already, advanced legislation or now law around protecting, New Yorkers who are engaging in regular activity at the courts from being subject to immigration enforcement while going to the courts, the Protect Our Courts Act, which advanced some time ago. But this proposal as framed by the governor, I guess would expand some of those protected spaces by requiring judicial warrants, by also creating a buffer zone around places of worship. Again, already kind of, part of the sentiment of the energy, obviously, of New York City, which stands as a sanctuary city with the sanctuary city laws, but also aligns with the sentiment of the New York for All Act. Now, the governor has not yet endorsed New York for All or made comment that it would be advancing. But these proposals do align with essentially a pullback of participation or allowance of the federal government to do whatever it wants as it relates to immigration enforcement. There's still the conversation around the use of resources in support or in furtherance of federal immigration actions, which is the main subject of New York for All that has not yet been discussed by the governor, but we have seen the Senate leader come out in support of that legislation as well. And I think it will end up becoming a part of the conversation by virtue of the direction that the governor seems to be leaning in. We, as a state conference, also endorsed New York for All this past weekend, put out a statement where essentially acknowledging that the federal government in many ways has forced this conversation where states have to really evaluate if they're interested in using resources to support this type of activity. I think as a state conference, we stood strong and believe that that is not a good use of state resources. And so we're looking to see what happens. But as our activation begins around the budget, we will be prioritizing both New York for All, as well as any type of remedy that can be created, for individuals who are, being impacted by these type of enforcement actions. Moving on from immigration, which again was a pretty significant moment in the speech. The overall focus was definitely on affordability. Was finding ways to be part of the broader conversation that we're having as a nation and as a state around making our lives more affordable. There's a couple of interesting proposals that I want to highlight that were of interest, but I'll start really with the biggest cost for most folks, which is housing. Last year, the governor advanced significant proposals to add revenue or funds to support redevelopment of homes. This year, we see that theme continuing with some increased cap on the number of land banks that could exist. These are kind of semi-private government entities, sometimes community entities that can take up housing stock and use that to redevelop and then put back out. And so we are interested in seeing those types of innovative solutions continue to be advanced. She's also highlighted the Move in New York program that was previously launched around modular homes and kind of a lower cost building process, and finding ways and more ways to incentivize people purchasing and building those homes, including developers who are building those in certain rural areas, but also making sure that while we're also creating the revenue stream or the financial support for these programs, that we're adding space for when they could exist. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out, and what other types of investments can be made to ensure that the housing supply or the housing demand that we have right now is the supply is created in creative ways. And so we'll see how that plays out. But that is something the New York State Conference is strongly in support of increasing New York's housing supply, and want to do so in a way that doesn't also destroy existing communities or overburden certain communities, et cetera. There was also obviously a focus on education and childcare within the affordability conversation. The governor announced last week, in partnership with the mayor of New York City, that there will be a guaranteed fully funding for universal childcare in New York City. Universally funded 2K. Universal childcare will be fully funded for 2K for 2 years. And then the rest of state will have some form of community childcare for newborns to 3-year-olds, and that will be supported through the state childcare assistance and voucher programs. All is coming together to ensure that New York's parents aren't paying more than $15 a month for childcare. Now, we know the exorbitant costs of childcare, particularly here in New York City, and she mentioned that in her speech as well, that those costs can go pretty high, someone's up to 26 and 40,000, I think was the number that was mentioned. Hey, Madam President, how you doing?
Hello, good morning.
I jumped into some of the policy stuff. I know the folks are like, he's going through it, but I jumped in.
Go ahead, don't mind me.
Okay, welcome. So just wrapping up on childcare, the expansion of voucher programs and credits are helpful, but definitely really interested in the implementation and what this looks like. The universal pre-K and 3K expansions took time, and so we'll see how universal 2K plays out in the city, and how this other form of early childcare plays out as well. So I'll pause here, Eldra. I was just going through some of the top line issues and takeaways that came out.
I was letting you go.
Yeah, I want to hear your reaction to the overall whole presentation, then I'll go back down into some of the issues and talk about our legislative priorities.
I mean, one, stylistically wise, I think the speech was typical of the governor. She is, I'm not saying this in a bad way, she's corny, and it definitely came off It's like corny mom speech. But I think that's what they were going for anyway. So in terms of stylistic wise, it was great. I don't, there's not much to say about the health of the state that's like jarring. The state is stable, right? Because we had over the past couple of years, particularly coming out of COVID, this influx, we were able to invest in a number of different things because we had the financial resources to do so. And that's everything from education and to economic development. And you saw her list out a number of the things that the state has been able to invest in all across the state. And I know that is particularly of concern to the rural and upstate areas, which really needed revitalization and economic development for a healthy state. That being said, is interesting some of the things that the governor chose to highlight and chose to double down on. This is in preparation. Obviously, you didn't want to pick large fights. It is an election year, right? So you don't want to propose things that would cause your base or your traditional supporters to be able to rally and use against you, right? So like we got to admit the landscape that we're in. And so being able to report on this is what we've been able to do. It definitely was a highlight reel of like, these are the investments that we made. Crime is down. We're investing in housing, education, our children. Like, these are all of the things that people are on the top list for people in an election year, particularly as it pertains to a state election or local election. And so I think they were very much politically astute in making sure to do those highlights, identify those partnerships that the governor's office has been able to do across the state, and then announce some things that are not big surprises, but allows you to continue to invest in that being education, which they talked about increasing there, obviously talking about housing and affordability issues how do we, the bottom line of that families have, right? Like, how do you make things affordable that are of our top concern and take the most money out of our pockets, right? That be education. And that's how we get the investment in childcare. That is also housing, and how do we get investment to increase housing stock and also reduce the cost of housing, and also healthcare. And then lastly, I think speaking to the current political moment by saying we're going to protect New Yorkers wherever they may have hailed from, and sort of being firm against the illegal actions of ICE. And I think particularly highlighting from a state executive perspective that this agency and the folks that they are deploying all over the country are not acting lawfully. And as the head of the state, we're going to do our best to protect people in the state of New York. So I think that's overall. I'm sure we're going to get into the details of each of those things, because just because we are presenting New York State as stable, there are still some inequities that exist that we have to fight on. This increased investment in affordable housing or housing in general is something that we're going to have to look at from an equity lens, because people are classified in these broad categories, right? It's the landlords against us. It is defining affordability. And from our perspective, we want to make sure that we are advocating on behalf of Black New Yorkers, and particularly Black New Yorkers who have been told for generations the way to build wealth in this country is through home ownership. And you have a swath of Black folks who, did what America told us to do, right? Invest and save and build wealth by having housing. And we've done that. And now there are all of these changes that may happen that may impede upon people's American dream of home ownership. And so we'll be viewing do that. But Chris, I know we have some things to go through specifically. So that's my overall impression from that standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on some of the topics. I dove already into some of the priorities or the proposals, I guess, that were identified. And, just starting at the top with immigration, I started with kind of the three proposals that she had included there. One was the private right of action proposal, which is really the Civil Rights Act, which is the Zellner bill, which I think is obviously needed and important. I think the devil's in the details, and we'll say that probably too much on this stream. But also the protecting spaces, it kind of starts to get to creating a buffer around our state institutions and really around our communities. And I think what do you think is the holdup before kind of a broader just endorsement of like withholding of state resources, the New York for All bill? The leader has already provided her support and understand this is going to be a priority this year. What do you think is holding back from just that statement if we're already there on these other issues?
I think this, again, is political, right? But I think the tide is turning over the last, I would say, couple of days, given what is happening in Minneapolis that started from ICE killing someone in the streets and has now magnified in terms of what is happening with ICE versus the protesters in Minneapolis. And I think before that point, some people's hesitation was, how do we get around the federal implications of ICE is doing a lawful thing, and this is they were trying to we have to follow the law kind of thing, versus thinking about this from a humane perspective and saying, how are we protecting the people in our state? And what's interesting about that is that people who may have different political ideology have no problems with saying the actions that they are taking are to protect their position as the state executive, but then also to protect their sovereignty as a state and the people within their state. And I think we have to be, particularly when you have a hostile federal government, we need state executives and local executives to exert their power in protecting the people that live and work within their state. And I think the tide of that is now turning. Definitely hearing the governor of New York say, people who do not have their lawful documents and they have been operating without a warrant and doing all that kind of stuff for weeks. But this is the first time, right? People are starting to say, oh, well, they're not doing things lawfully. It was like, we've been telling you they ain't been lawful for the last couple of months since this started, right? But the tide is now turning because the popular opinion is now turning. And it's not from the perspective of, well, people are here illegally, or people, that's not the focus now. Now it's the overreach, right? Because, now they're, killing Americans, or they're engaging with lawful citizens, right? So I think the tide is turning there, and it is encouraging to see state executives catch up with the people who have been saying this is unlawful, and we need people in elected leadership to act.
Yeah. Now, I fully agree that the public sentiment is definitely changing. We're seeing the mass mobilizations. We are engaged with the Hands Off coalition, trying to make sure that folks are trained in how to respond when these raids occur. I do think that there's also, though, a broader sentiment of making sure that we're going far enough to protect folks. And I think that the civil criminal distinction that she made a couple times, it was kind of some signaling.
Hmm.
We've always coordinated as a state with immigration enforcement on a criminal side. But it is an interesting thing that she's kind of still standing there because it kind of feels more like it's status quo then, right? Like it's it's an unwillingness to go beyond where we were, even though the situation has changed. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is why the state conference being involved, not only in the Hands Off Coalition, but also endorsing, as you and the Vice President of Youth and College, Sophie Farrell, were just up this week before the State of the State, endorsing New Yorkers for All. Right, it is important for us to stand together against this overreach and the federal administration just running roughshod over our laws and into our streets. It's something that we all have to stand against. And even if you think, well, they're not attacking me, they are attacking you because they are attacking your neighbors,
Mhm.
and you will be next. And you're not standing up just because, oh, I'm going to be in harm's way at some point. You're standing up because, as a participant, I call it the office of the citizen, right? You have the office of the president, the office of mayor, all of those kind of stuff. But the office of citizen is the most important office in this country. The Constitution says so. And if you are troubled by what is happening in our streets and how you are being governed, it is our right to stand up and say, we do not want this. This is not how that we want the federal government to act. This is not how we want states to comply, states and local communities to comply. And we, the people, are the most important aspect of the Constitution and of this country. And we have every right to stand together and demand something different. And so that's why I'm glad the New York State Conference is part of these coalitions.
Absolutely. So, being mindful of time, I do want to just kind of jump down to affordability.
Sure.
Obviously, the centerpiece of not just her campaign, that's launching now, but
Hmm.
also of the mayoral race, the midterms, everything is going to be centered on affordability. So she's the child care issue has become one of the largest parts of that conversation because of the mayor here in New York City, Mayor Mamdani. I know we have some folks not from here that are listening. So his commitment to universal child care. So I want to talk about what it means for the state to be kind of essentially pulled along in this direction to provide right
Hmm.
this necessary access to this necessary relief. She's got a couple different proposals. She's committed publicly to universal 2K in New
Hmm.
York City over the next 2 years, and statewide getting to universal pre-K in by 2028. Um, Childcare is such a huge cost. We
Hmm.
know as parents, we both got mad kids.
We
um,
both got back. Do we have I think we have a basketball team together.
we got something. Yeah. We know how much of a cost this is. Can you talk just the reaction to not just the
Yeah.
proposal, but then the reaffirming of the commitment from the earlier press conference this week that her and the mayor had, and the reaction that kind of folks are bringing.
Yeah, the case of affordability is, while affordability is broad, right? But I think it is important to identify the things that are costing most people money, most families money on a regular basis. And we talked about that at the top. It's childcare, healthcare, and rent or housing, right? Like those are the three things. And so it's significant to say from the state perspective that we're going to invest in that. But I don't want folks to miss the larger conversation of this, because while yes, it is significant in helping our pockets in terms of it being something you don't have to pay for, but think what else is on the pipeline. If we are saying we're going to have to universal childcare in that way, we're also going to have to hire more people. We're also going to have to develop more resources and facilities where these 2K programs and childcare programs will be. And so that creates additional economic opportunity, right? Give you an example. The child care center that my children go to, their teacher who is working in there, she is going and completing her master's degree in early childhood, and she's like, I want to be able to, open my own facility or to expand on this facility. That is the kind of economic investment that's also going to be needed, right? It's not only paying the fees, but also ensuring that we have the facilities and resources. And there is also going to be the thing of the people who are working there, making sure that they are getting paid a living wage, right? So then there's also coordination with unions and with the workers on identifying what a living wage, because they are not being paid a living wage at current rates, right? And so what does that also look like? So even when we're talking about affordability and talking about universal childcare, we also have to expand and look at what are the other things that are connected to that can also promote economic stability and build thriving Black communities. I think of the same thing of housing. Everybody's talking about housing. I was like, oh, and then I'll be able to get an apartment that I can afford. But then how are we looking at the entire pipeline of building more housing in New York State?
Yeah.
Making sure Black New Yorkers are a part of the conception, the building, the drafting, the marketing, all aspects of the housing pipeline that exists. So if we have this greater attention on childcare, on housing, right, we also need to make sure that Black New Yorkers are connected to the all of the tentacles that will be in place in order to make that a reality.
Yeah, and we talked about some of the housing proposals, just the expansion of tools and resources to redevelop properties, and then the modular homes. I think earlier this year or last year, now it's still early, so I can still say 25. The governor, celebrated the modular homes coming online. I think there was like two or three that tenants had actually, or the new owners actually had just moved into.
Mhm.
Earlier this year. And so I think the expansion of programs like that are going to be important. As you said, there's a nuanced conversation around housing that has to be had, right? And our rush and need to build supply has to be intentional. These are jobs that are created in process, but then the end product also has to make sense, and
Yeah.
I think we'll get some more into that, but I just want to highlight a couple of other issues that we don't have to
Hmm.
talk about too much, but that I think dovetail nicely with the fact that we are also in a moment where we need to upskill. We've talked about AI and what the impact is going to have on the job market, but I think also important to recognize and celebrate, the expansion of programs like CUNY and SUNY Connect,
Hmm.
allowing adults to get back into the classroom to learn new skills. This is something that our youth and college division, Sophia and Miles and the whole crew are also championing. Just knowing that some folks and younger folks in particular are taking non-traditional approaches to higher education and then to professional development. So want to acknowledge those as some of the necessary steps. But there's also some concerns there, right? And we get to AI, and I think the governor mentioned data centers as one of those things that she and we have to pay some greater attention to. Because the NAACP as a national organization, we have a strong environmental and climate justice principles that guide us. And at the same time as we're interested in creating jobs and leaning into the future. We also have, a policy conversation that we have to have around AI and its uses. And I think what was interesting, actually, and we've talked about this, but for the folks listening, her proposal that was included in the state around disclosure when AI technology is being used. That I know you in the past worked on legislation with Senator Parker to do just that. Give me an initial reaction, I guess, to inclusion of that. And we've also seen the RAISE Act signed into law, a bill that we also supported as the state conference. The attempt to start to regulate and put our eyes and arms around what is happening with AI, not just as a technology, but also in the construction of data centers that are used, that are necessary to support the technology.
Yeah, and as there is increased use of AI technology, and we see in places that have way more space, right, than New York City. I think, believe in Mississippi and Georgia and others, some of those data centers are being built. And so it was encouraging to hear the governor talk about preemptively creating legislation that if this is built, that they have to create their own energy, and not sort of drain down on our resources. I think that's incredibly important. And you're right, I did back in 2023 a draft for with Senator Kevin Parker, the first legislation on disclosure of AI technology, and specifically as it pertains to democracy. Right, we know that Black folks, Black voters, are a number one target for misinformation and disinformation, given our voting history. And I was concerned back then about the use of the technology, particularly targeting our communities and swaying votes, or depressing votes. And so that legislation was drafted back in 2023. That same year, I drafted a resolution when I was president of Brooklyn NAACP, that was passed by the national NAACP, by all of the units, on ensuring that we have disclosure around the use of AI, and preventions. Now, states have also implemented different versions since then, that talk about penalties and things of that nature. But one of the things we have to look at, particularly if anything is going to be introduced and passed this year, AI is so quick. Right? You can go and create a video while we're talking right now and put that out. And so by the time you get to fines and fees and things like that, it could be a whole year later, and it's already done the damage. Right? And so we have to be sophisticated in terms of how that we pull down these things and also go after bad actors. And we have to be much quicker than government is used to being during this time.
Yeah,
So
thank you
I
for
think
that.
those kinds of things are important.
Yeah, no, fully agree, fully agree. And there's a lot of work to do there, and we'll see what the final proposals look like on this and all the other proposals that have been presented by the governor. There's another item that I wanted to bring up that is something that we've worked on, that we have a lot of questions about, because it is, in order for our Black New Yorkers to really see themselves in these types of moments, it's important for their concerns and needs to be addressed, particularly those that they've been talking about for some time. And I think
Mhm.
want to acknowledge proposals to deal with our lead issues in our water supply,
Mhm.
and not just infrastructure wise, but also in terms of general pipe replacement, et cetera, but also like in our schools and our school
Mhm.
infrastructure. So wanted to acknowledge the commitment there, but also this is one of those moments where there's a statement of principle that we all agree with, that we shouldn't have lead in our schools, and we should be very mindful of making sure that our children are being exposed to lead poisoning. But that the issue isn't necessarily the funds coming down from the top. The issue is the implementation. And so
Yeah.
just just like with the AI, I want to raise up that issue as one of particular interest to the state conference. We saw the comptroller put out a report last week saying I think 30 million of funds was allocated last year, and only 20, or last couple of years, maybe I think it was 25, and then only 23 million of that is still completely unused, untapped, has not been used to improve the infrastructure necessary. And so there remains moments where we have these concerns of why these issues are not being addressed. And so one of many that we've talked about for a long time, that we're waiting to see some greater action. But hopefully incentivizing both municipalities to go and use the funds that have already been allocated them to improve this infrastructure, as well as talking more publicly about the fact that these funds exist and have been allocated, will provide some of that necessary public pressure to make the adjustments that are needed here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a general overview of the stuff. But I got some questions for you, and I'm
Oh,
sure folks
okay.
are interested. in lining up the state of state. We've seen the AI proposal. We see some other, some leaning forward on immigration. Your engagement with the governor, with the executive council team around, any of this, is that something that has happened, or do you expect
Mhm.
to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think most folks know that the governor and I are building a relationship, and having conversations with her about how some of these things are impacting Black New Yorkers is something that we keep an open line of communication about. In instances where we can full throttle support issues, like universal childcare, but then also I think relying on using our power and our organizing strength to highlight the issues that are of particular concern to Black New Yorkers, and how can we ensure, particularly as I mentioned, some things like housing, and making sure that Black New Yorkers are part of the entire pipeline. That's not only something I've been in discussion with the governor about, but then also the mayor of New York City about. And then we're also meeting with the newly elected mayors all across the state, being in Syracuse, Buffalo, or Albany, to talk about how this implementation will take place, but ensuring that people are included in the pipeline. And then us working with our partners, whether it be Urban League or NAN or any other organizations across the state, and ensuring that our communities are prepared, our businesses are prepared to engage in the process overall.
Yeah, and that's that. And I asked the question because that's the question that our folks are going to have. How much
Mhm,
of this, not only speaks to the concerns or the priorities of Black New Yorkers, but how much was informed by the priorities and
mhm,
concerns of Black New Yorkers. And
mhm,
obviously, we sit here as a conduit for those concerns. So I think just understanding kind of how we can influence this process is really important for folks to understand.
mhm,
We of course will be doing our regular lobbying, and we'll go up for our lobby day in March. I think it's March 4th. And we'll meet with our legislative leaders, our champions. But as this budget process picks up, we know we've got a couple of key dates coming up. We've got the budget language officially dropping probably sometime next week, maybe. I don't have any inside information. I'm just generally, it's about a week and a half from the state of the state where we get that official language. But then we've got these budget hearings. We've got, separate one house bills coming out from the legislature, and them laying out their priorities. What do you think is one priority, I guess, that we haven't, or we're not seeing addressed? I've got one, but one that we're not seeing addressed in this budget proposal, in the state of the state proposal, that we would have
yeah.
liked to see highlighted here. I think immigration was important, affordability is important, but what's missing?
I think again the nuance of housing, and specifically how we're going to protect the folks who own homes, and ensuring that their homes are not being taken from them, and also how we are differentiating from a landlord perspective. I think there's a very different thing between a homeowner with one apartment, two, or three, versus corporatized landlords who own multiple buildings with hundreds of units. And I think that is the nuance I have not seen from any of the housing proposals, whether it be in the state of the state, or listening to mayors across the state, is that folks are not talking about that nuance and lumping people together. And that's something that is very strategic and different that I haven't seen.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I think folks are interested in seeing, City of Yes,
Mhm,
passed and changed some zoning across the city, really allowing for, a lot of, excuse me, a lot of zoning changes that folks weren't always prepared for, right? They understand the need for housing supply to be created, but, didn't anticipate or don't always understand what that's going to mean. I'm out here in Southeast Queens, so, my experience is a little different here, but
mhm,
really waving the flag on nuancing our housing conversation, to make sure that we're not really pulling back on the promise of home ownership that we as a society and as a state have made to those who pursued it. I think that's a concern that we'll make sure that our we don't separate our community in talking about the need to house the unhoused, but also to make sure those who are in houses stay in those houses while we still do the difficult work of creating more supply. So that's a great one to highlight. I think for me, the one that's missing obviously is continued work on prison reform. An issue that's obviously very important to me and I've worked on for a long time. But
I'm sorry. Did you expect a governor who's going to run for reelection this year to talk anything about prison reform?
well, no, what I think is that we saw the towards the last few days of the year her sign the prison omnibus bill that passed last year that was brought on after the murder of Robert Brooks. I think what we're looking for rather is just a continued engagement because
Mhm.
if you're not on top of our correctional system, that's largely out of sight and out of mind, you don't engage with it. And so we saw the final signing of the omnibus bill, which was a thing that we endorsed as a state conference. That was helpful. But there's still so much more work to do. There's also, the fact that, that because docs is still understaffed at the state level, locals are still holding way more individuals than they should. And then, we also have people being held in precincts sometimes because there's no space in the local jail because there's no space at the state institution. We've started a conversation on prison reform around dealing with kind of the culture of violence and accountability. I just would like to see that continue and like to see that addressed. We've had questions coming in. I just want to make sure that we're making space for those. Um,
Yep.
any other questions come in? If you all have questions, please you can put them in the chat. I think we're streaming on Instagram as well as YouTube. So please feel free to add those questions there. One more that came in. Sorry, one that did come in. Um, yeah, so we're going to go through our agenda real quick, but in terms of the legislature and their role in this process, I guess the question was asked, like, is the legislature supportive of our goals? I think the broader question is the legislature engaging with this budget and what priorities we'll see come from them, uh, most of which will likely align with our priorities. We've mentioned New York for All already. Are there any other issues that you're hearing about on the state level that the legislature may try to advance during this budget negotiation process?
What's interesting is that I have not heard from the members of the legislature in terms of what they are going to prioritize during this budget cycle. I mean, it's an election year for them as well. I think they want to address issues of affordability and things that might be enticing to their constituents. It was going to be, and people don't want to fight, right? So, particularly during this year. But I have not heard from state legislatures that anything is significantly different priorities than the governor does. And that's something of note because we usually do. But that's not something that I have heard as of yet.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can influence that by going over our legislative agenda with them, which we will
Hmm.
be doing over the course of these next couple of weeks and months. Of course, culminating with our lobby day on March 4th. I just want to go through a couple of those priority items that I
Sure.
think, yeah. So, we talked about New York for All, the new uh, the endorsement by the state conference of New York for All. I think is an important development. We talked about the Civil Rights Act, which is essentially allowing individuals to have a right of action against federal officials who are acting under the color of law, but depriving their constitutional rights, constitutional liberties. So those are super important to us. But also, as it relates to, I guess, public safety, criminal justice is a broad term. It's continued to expand. We continue to have and prioritize our decarceration bills to make sure that we're easing really the burden on the system by getting folks out of our state correctional institutions who are older, who have served significant lengthy sentences, getting them a second look at their sentences is one of the proposals, Second Look Act, but also incentivizing good behavior, et cetera, through the Earned Time Act. All of these proposals focused on decarceration, which I'll just list real quick, all get to finding ways to reduce our population and get some of our folks who've been inside for far too long without consideration for release and opportunity for consideration. We also, from an education standpoint, we still are pushing hard for solutions, not suspensions, which would reduce the use of suspensions for younger students, leading up to one, just a reduction, but also some more restorative practice being introduced into our schools so that kids aren't missing educational instruction. We've also, in the education bucket, are working to ensure that young people, kids have access to recess, particularly our elementary school age kids, and then our college kids have actual real access to education through our endorsement of the Fair College Admissions Act, which would ban legacy considerations and admissions processes in New York State. I want to just, on the environmental side, we've been a partner on the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act, which is a significant bill to reframe how we deal with plastic waste and single-use plastics. The bottle bill, which would increase the refund value of beverage containers to 10 cents from 5. This has been 10 cents for forever. So it's been 5 cents for forever. So that's important. The Beauty Justice Act, again, dealing with those toxins that are in some of the products that we use in our hair and makeup. And dealing with PFAS in general as known carcinogens, finding ways to restrict the use of them, especially when they're not needed in certain products, rounds out our environmental agenda. On the health equity side, the Fair Pricing Act is some legislation that would cap the cost of routine services. We think this is also a part of an affordability agenda that's super important, and that we have to talk about the rising cost of healthcare. There's no other way to talk about it without first addressing costs. So I want to prioritize that. And then just on the civic engagement part, we talked about this briefly, but democracy during detention remains a priority, and finding ways to ensure that those who are incarcerated or are being held before conviction are still able to engage in their right to vote. And then the Student Voter Empowerment Act is also a bill that would encourage student voter registration participation on college campuses, ensuring that every of our higher education institutions in the state have a plan to increase student voter participation. So that's some of our highlights from our legislative agenda. I'm trying to run through it because I know we've been talking, but I'll pause here. Eljoy, any questions or anything you want to highlight?
Well, I want to hear, I'm looking forward to hearing from people over the next couple of weeks, as you'll see more of our engagement in pushing forth our legislative agenda, in addition to budget justice, because the additional thing is also in this budget, how are they funding communities for different things, right? We'll be combing through the budget document after it's released and ensuring that there are no hidden cuts or realignment in terms of finances to the agencies that are critical to our communities. And also it's all going supports for economic development, also ensuring that we're investing in strategies to lift up small businesses and businesses from in Black communities, right? So there is much more, as you said, devil in the details of the budget language that we'll have to comb through that we don't have the language on yet to be able to highlight. And I'm also looking forward to how the community will continue to be engaged in this, because, you being a member of NAACP, you being, living in this state, have every right to add your voice to the work that is being done to ensure that your tax dollars are being used effectively to build and maintain Black thriving communities. And so it would be interesting to see what else people will lift up as needed. As you know, and some of you know that we did a survey of our members in the community we serve into the 5 areas across the state that have new mayors. And one of the things that were highlighted is people wanted to see more of an investment in building thriving economic Black communities across the state. And so that's another thing I'm looking for. It was great to see the investment in revitalizing Albany's downtown. Most of you don't know that Albany has a significant Black population. And so that's helping to build thriving Black communities. But how is that going to transfer into other places across the state? In Buffalo, in Syracuse, that's not just centered around, entertainment and stadiums and big infrastructure projects like that, but also main streets and small businesses and streetscape and things of that nature. So looking forward to seeing all of that as well.
Yeah, and so we'll be going through this again as the language comes out and getting some details for these proposals. There's a ton here also on youth mental health that's definitely of interest, and regulating social media, etc. All proposals I think are of great interest, and we would definitely want to see the impact and the scope. But we'll pause here. And I'll end with a question to you, which is just you giving your overall one grade of the presentation, and you can factor in the proposals and the scope of them, but the presentation, and then just a broad statement or analysis of if this met the expectation, I guess, that you had for the governor for her state of the state this year.
Say that again.
Oh, the grade. How would you grade the
Oh,
presentation?
the presentation, I give her a solid. I give her a solid A. Yeah.
Okay. And then was it what you expected it to be this year in terms of meeting the moment? I think she led so much more with the tariffs that was a little bit surprising, not because of their impact, but because how fast the news is moving.
Yeah.
We have not been talking about the tariffs as much in the last several weeks, and so she definitely. I mean, it's she's obviously focused on small businesses. She comes from a small business family, etc. But I was surprised by how much that led in the beginning around our policy. But obviously, it's impacting our budgets. But that was something that was surprising, to be such a leader, not so much pushing back on federal cuts to monies that's supposed to be coming back to the state related to TANF and other programs that are being cut. I think was some things missing for me.
Yeah, I would agree on that in terms of missing. Also, overall, even though I gave her an A for presentation, in terms of content, like I expected her to go bigger. I mean, we're in New York after all, right? And so to be able to, and we have a very, very powerful economic standing in the country. We have a very powerful just narrative in terms of being New York. And so I expected it to be bigger, not just like bigger going after Trump, because I think her strategy is to not sort of poke the bear too much. But so I think that's her overall strategy. But I think that I'm disappointed overall quite often with the state legislature and the governor, in that it's just like, you got it, like, you can go bigger, we can do more. So being able to push them to do that, I think, is a part of our strategy, and making the push. And that's the reason why we're going to be organizing through this year, is not only moving on the budget, not only moving on the legislative piece, but also pushing those who represent us to go bigger in order to protect New Yorkers and to also build during this time. We don't have to be responsive all the time. We can be proactive, and we can build the thriving communities across the state, whether they're in major areas like New York City, or if you're in more in Mid-Hudson, if you're upstate, which, Albany isn't the extent. Isn't the argument of like Albany begins upstate or something like that? But I definitely think that we need to push those who represent us to do more and go bigger. and we don't have to just be cautiously optimistic because of what is happening on the federal level. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us and participating in the conversation. There were a couple of questions about whether or not we're still engaging on reparations. The answer to that is yes. We'll be sharing the testimony that I gave with the recommendations to the Reparations Commission on what should be included in the final report, which I think as of last week, we are a year out from the recommendations report that the commission will put on. So we will be consistently engaging in that work. We will also be engaging, there's any moment now, this week or the top of next week, the Supreme Court will be dropping a decision on redistricting and on voting rights. We'll be engaged in that. Thankfully, we were proactive in the state of New York in passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York to ensure that we are protecting New Yorkers. So we have that in place here in New York City. In New York State, sorry, and we will be doing a specific conversation about that. There is also a number of different commissions and acts that are going on that we want to make sure that Black New Yorkers are tuned into as well. So thank you so very much for tuning in with us and participating. Please stay tuned. If you are not on our list, if you're not on our newsletter, you can go to our website, NYSNAACP .net, and they'll put it at the bottom to stay engaged with us. NYSNAACP.org. You can also become a member to stay engaged. And if you are a member of the Black Press, we definitely want you to stay engaged with us so we can continue to feed this content and information to you so that you can report out to your readers and your listeners as well what is happening from a Black perspective here in the state of New York. With that, I'm L. Joy Williams, the president of the NAACP New York State Conference. Thank you to our executive director, Chris Alexander, who is part of the team that leads our legislative agenda, in addition to our committee chairs and civic engagement chairs throughout the state. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.